Hello and welcome. I recently watched a very nice video uploaded a couple of weeks ago by Steve Mould about a paradox to do with levers. And I just thought I'd share some of my own thoughts on this paradox. Now, to be clear, you don't have to have watched that video to understand this video. I intend this video to be an entirely self-contained video. But I'll include a link to Steve Mould's video in the video description. So, let's imagine we have a weightless plate resting on which is an object of some mass m, and we can apply an upward force on the plate. And now a question that we can ask is, what value would this force have to be in order to accelerate the plate upwards with some pre-specified acceleration a while the object is still resting on the plate? So let's call the answer to this question Fa, where the subscript a refers to the value of the desired acceleration. And really, this value is a function of the other parameters that might affect it, namely the mass m and the gravitational field strength, which I'll denote g. Now, unsurprisingly, there's a very simple formula for this, but I deliberately don't want to say the formula yet. Okay, but now a second question that we could ask is, if I just want to accelerate the plate upwards without caring about what the value of the acceleration is, then what threshold does the applied force need to exceed in order to achieve that? So this is going to be a number that's less than Fa for any given positive value of a, because we don't need the plate to accelerate as fast as a, we just need the plate to accelerate. Now, an equivalent formulation of this question is, what force needs to be applied to the plate to maintain that the system is in equilibrium, right? Because that's the same as the force that needs to be exceeded in order to accelerate the plate upwards. So, depending on circumstance, sometimes one is interested in keeping a system in equilibrium, and sometimes one is interested in trying to get a system to start moving in a certain direction. So these are two different types of practical problem, but in terms of quantities, the question of the force required to maintain equilibrium and the question of the force that needs to be exceeded to induce motion will have the same answer. Well, anyway, in this particular setup, I'm going to denote the answer to this question by F0. And again, this is a function of the mass m and the gravitational field strength g. Okay, well, let's now start by answering the second question. Unsurprisingly, the answer is simply equal to the weight of the object. I guess usually this is written mg rather than gm, but for my purposes here, I'm going to be regarding g as a fixed constant while thinking about what effect the value of m has on the answer to the question. And so that's why I'm representing this as a constant coefficient g in front of a variable called m. And now, as for question 1, well, I'll leave it as an exercise for those who want to verify the answer, but it matches what I think one would intuitively expect. So again, it's a value being multiplied by m, but that value now is g plus a. Now, for reasons I'll come to later, I want to point out that we could also express this with the brackets expanded out, namely as gm plus am. But of course, it's simpler in this factorized form. And so, if we fix a and fix g, and just consider how the quantities F0 and Fa depend on the mass m, then we find that these quantities are directly proportional to each other, because each of them is proportional to m. So a way to think about this is F0 is a quantity that can be practically measured directly through experiment. And similarly, for any given value of a, Fa is likewise a quantity that can be practically measured directly through experiment. But the value of m itself is probably not something that can be so directly experienced, so to speak. Rather, it's a parameter of our Newtonian model of the physics of this setup that is then experimentally accessible by virtue of how the model predicts the value of the mass m to be manifested in the value of a quantity like F0 or Fa. And so, these two experimentally measurable quantities are directly proportional to each other by virtue of each of them being implicitly directly proportional to the more hidden variable m. Okay, and now let's move on to another setup. Here, we have a weightless beam connected to a fixed pivot, such that the beam can freely rotate about the pivot, but can't move in any other way. And we imagine that we have, again, an object of some mass m resting on the beam at a distance r to the right of the pivot. And with the initial configuration of the beam being horizontal and stationary, we apply a downward force on the beam at a position of distance d to the left of the pivot. And now, once again, we can ask, what value would this force have to be in order for the beam to undergo a pre-specified angular acceleration anticlockwise of alpha? So, there are a couple of important things that need clarifying about this question. Firstly, what does angular acceleration mean? Well, just as acceleration refers to the rate of change of velocity, so likewise angular acceleration refers to the rate of change of angular velocity. And what does angular velocity mean? Angular velocity means basically speed of rotation. It's angle rotated through per unit time. So it's measured in radians per second, or after a rescaling by 2 pi, it can be measured in revolutions per second. And so, if the beam starts stationary, and then starts undergoing an anticlockwise angular acceleration, then that implies that it will gradually start rotating anticlockwise. And now this leads on to the other important point that I need to clarify, and that is, when I ask this question of what force is needed to achieve a given angular acceleration alpha, I'm just interested in achieving that specified value of angular acceleration at the initial moment from when the force starts being applied. I'm not interested in the question of whether I can sustain the angular acceleration being equal to alpha over some duration of time after I start applying the force. That's going to be a really complicated question. You're going to have to start worrying about how the object on the beam will slide about and or rotate, or whether you assume that the object is rigidly attached to the beam at whatever position r is chosen. But my point is, I don't want to worry about any of that. I'm just asking about achieving that angular acceleration alpha as the angular acceleration at the start of the motion that ensues from when my force is applied. Okay, so let's call the force required to achieve this F alpha, where again the subscript alpha refers to the value of the desired angular acceleration. And again, this is a function of the other variables that might affect it, namely the mass m, the gravitational field strength g, the position where I apply the force, as represented by the variable d, and the position of where the object is placed, as represented by the variable r. And once again, we can also have a question too, which asks, if I just want to accelerate the beam anticlockwise without caring about what the value of the angular acceleration is, then what threshold does the applied force need to exceed in order to achieve that? And again, an equivalent formulation would simply be, what force do I need to apply to the beam just to maintain that the whole system is in equilibrium? So once again, let's call the answer to this question F0, which again is going to be a function of the same variables. So now, let's again start by addressing the second question. For my force to exactly balance out the turning effect of the object's weight, we're going to have that my force times d is equal to the weight of the object times r. That's the principle of levers. And remember once again that the beam itself is assumed to be weightless. And so, bringing d to the right-hand side, we get this expression for F0. And so, if we imagine that we don't get to control the position at which we're applying the force, in other words, if we imagine the variable d as being a constant, just like g is a constant, then what we're saying is that the force required to balance the presence of the object on the other side is proportional to the product of the mass m of the object and the distance r of the object from the pivot. And this reflects a kind of natural intuition about levers that would be something like as follows. If you multiply the distance of your object from the pivot by a given factor while dividing the mass of your object by the same factor, then this change should have no effect on what you feel at any specified point on the other side of the lever. So the amount of force that you feel yourself having to counteract in order to keep the system in equilibrium feels the same between these two scenarios. And so now, thinking about question 1, where I'm interested in achieving a specified angular acceleration alpha, so let's imagine that I'm still constrained to applying my force at this same position of fixed distance d to the left of the pivot. So to achieve a specific angular acceleration, again, just at the initial moment from when I start applying the force, well, this same intuition that I just described suggests that the force required to achieve this should remain the same if I double the distance r while halving the mass m, right? So in other words, what we should have is that F alpha is equal to some multiple of the product of the mass m and the distance r, where the factor in front is just some value determined by the given values g, d, and alpha. And so in particular, this would imply that for given alpha, the quantity F alpha is proportional to the quantity F0 when m and r are allowed to be varied, just like we saw in the previous setup, where Fa was proportional to F0 under variation of the mass m. Okay, well, there's only one little problem with all this, and that's that it's wrong. Here's the actual formula for F alpha. And so what we see is that, similarly to in the previous setup, the formula is the sum of two terms, where the first term involves a prefactor of g, while the second term involves a prefactor of alpha, and the first term is in fact exactly the same as the formula for F0. But while the first term has linear dependence on r, the second term has quadratic dependence on r. And so what this means is that if I double the distance r while halving the mass m, it will require a greater force to achieve my specified angular acceleration alpha. And so, in particular, for a given value of alpha, F0 is not proportional to F alpha. Doubling r while halving m won't affect F0, but it will affect F alpha for my non-zero value alpha. So this is essentially the lever paradox that Steve Mould talked about in his video. Namely, we assume that what is felt at a given point on the left side of the lever is purely dependent on the product of m and r, so that achieving a particular angular acceleration is no easier or harder when r is doubled while m is halved. But that's wrong. So that's the paradox. I mean, different people have different sharpnesses of mechanical intuition, and so maybe for some people the truth of the matter doesn't feel at all counterintuitive. But for me, like for Steve Mould, I think I would have naturally fallen into the trap of feeling convinced by this intuition to believe that F alpha probably is proportional to the product of M and R. And so I found it quite interesting to discover that this is actually false. And so what I now want to do for the remainder of this video is to address two questions, which in my view are quite distinct questions, even though the answers to these questions will have some level of overlap. The first question is, what was the underlying fallacy that we implicitly believed when we went with the intuition that led us down to the wrong answer? And then the second question is, can we give an intuition for why F alpha has faster dependence on R than F naught does? Now, you might be thinking, well, aren't those two questions the same question? Well, ironically, in a strange way, at a kind of meta level, that kind of thinking feels a bit like the same fallacy as the fallacy that led us down the wrong path in the first place. So anyway, what was the fallacy that led us to conclude that the difficulty in achieving a given angular acceleration is simply proportional to the product of M and R, just like how the difficulty in maintaining equilibrium is proportional to the product of M and R? I believe the answer is a fallacy that comes under the category of conflating equality of quantities with equality of concepts. If I have two variables that are defined in different ways, but then I find that the two variables often end up having the same value as each other, then as this experience of working with the same value for both variables builds up, I can start to lose sight of the fact that what the one variable quantifies and what the other variable quantifies are not actually the same concept. For example, we've known since primary school that n lots of m and m lots of n evaluate to the same number, but n collections each of size m and m collections each of size n are not the same scenario as each other, even if they happen to give the same total number of objects as each other. Well, in our case, there's an important principle of physics that can be expressed by the equation that gravitational mass, which basically means what you multiply gravitational field strength by to get gravitational force, is equal to inertial mass, which basically means what you multiply an object's acceleration by to get the net force acting on the object. But of course, the very fact that I referred to this equation as a principle, rather than a tautology or a definition, shows that the two concepts are not the same concept as each other. And of course, this is further supported by the fact that I actually gave you a quick definition of each of the two terms, and these definitions were clearly distinct from each other. And so, even though we have this principle that says that gravitational mass is equal to inertial mass, that doesn't mean that the concept of gravitational mass, which I've represented here as the words gravitational mass inside inverted commas, right? It doesn't mean that the concept of gravitational mass is equal to the concept of inertial mass. In fact, there was a comment on Steve Mould's video essentially to the effect that what I'm saying here lies at the root of the fallacy. And he replied, saying that he actually had been thinking of mentioning the matter in his video, but had come to the conclusion that that wasn't the core of the issue, although as a result of the comment, he was now starting to rethink. And this kind of question of identifying a fallacy in our intuition is a bit of a tricky one because it's not just a matter of physics, it's also a matter of analysing our own thinking. Well, let me now explain a bit more precisely what gravitational mass and inertial mass are, and then I'll try and explain how this fallacy of imagining as if the two concepts are the same concept feeds into the erroneous intuition about levers that we're interested in. So, Newton's model of physics involves a concept of forces and a concept of inertia, also referred to as inertial mass. And inertia is an inherent property of an object. It doesn't depend on the motion of the object or the forces acting on the object. And Newtonian physics includes within it a model of motion that says that the following equation holds in an inertial reference frame. But don't worry if you don't know what that means. The equation itself says the vector sum of the external forces acting on an object is equal to the product of the object's inertia and the object's acceleration, or more precisely, the acceleration of its center of mass. So the key point to take from this is that inertia measures resistance to changes in motion, because for a given set of forces, a larger inertia implies a smaller acceleration, and acceleration is a way of quantifying change in motion. Okay, so I have this model of motion, and I want to highlight that our ability to have formulated this law of motion was not contingent on having a model of which types of forces are present in this vector sum, nor a model for what the value of any one of those forces is. But Newtonian physics does also tell us what one of those types of forces is, namely gravity. And so we'll also want a model of gravity. And one way we can formulate our model of gravity is as follows. We have a concept of gravitational mass, and again, gravitational mass is an inherent property of an object. It doesn't change with the object's motion or with the gravitational field that the object lies in. But the actual gravitational force that the object experiences can depend on the gravitational field that the object is in. But what our model says, roughly speaking, is that in a given local gravitational field, where one could place a variety of different objects with different gravitational masses, the gravitational force on an object is proportional to the object's gravitational mass. And we refer to the constant of proportionality as the gravitational field strength. Now, this is not the complete Newtonian model of gravity because I haven't said how to actually calculate the gravitational field strength. But that's not going to be relevant for this video. So here we have a model of physics, and in principle, we could choose to stop here. But we would obviously want to compare a model of physics with experiential observation, not only to check whether our model correctly describes reality, but also in case this will help us to add further details to the model to enable it to predict more things than it currently can. And indeed, there is a key observation that we can make that is not currently built into our model. And that is that in a given local gravitational field, different objects have the same freefall acceleration. So what effect does this have on our model? Well, freefall means by definition that the only force acting on the object is gravitational force. And so the way this observation gets incorporated into our model is to specify that there is a direct proportionality between gravitational mass and inertia. And remember, I had already specified that these two quantities are both inherent properties of an object. And so what I'm saying is that there is some absolutely constant value that serves as the constant of proportionality between the two. And without loss of generality, we can specify that constant as just being the number 1, which is equivalent to saying that the gravitational field strength is quantified precisely as being the freefall acceleration. So gravitational mass and inertia are the same quantity, which we just call mass, and typically give it the symbol m. And so when we're learning physics at school, we learn the model of motion in terms of an already named variable called mass, and we also learn the model of gravity in terms of this same already named variable. Okay, so now going back to the lever. The process of deriving the formula for F0 has nothing to do with the amount of inertia that the object has. If you consider the beam and the object together as one system, then the external forces acting on this system are Well, there's the contact with the pivot, but that has no turning effect around the pivot. But then the other two forces are the force of gravity acting on the object and the force that we're applying on the left side of the lever. And so the only consideration to determine F0 is that the turning effect of our force should balance out the turning effect of gravity. So it's only gravitational mass that's relevant here. And I can make this statement precise. There's nothing stopping us from imagining a version of Newtonian physics in which inertial mass and gravitational mass are not constrained to being equal to each other or constrained to any other relationship with each other. And we can still ask what the formula for F0 is in this generalized version of Newtonian physics. And assuming that the beam has zero gravitational mass, the answer will be precisely that the formula for F0 is what I've got written here with the gravitational mass of the object in place of the letter m. So even though in this generalized model the object's gravitational mass and the object's inertial mass are different variables, the value of the inertial mass will not come into this formula, only the value of the gravitational mass will. And then in the formula for F alpha, what we have is that the first term corresponds to the contribution necessary for overcoming the turning effect of gravity, and there it's only the gravitational mass that's relevant. And then the second term corresponds to the further force needed to achieve the desired angular acceleration in the opposite direction to what the natural effect of gravity would have been. And for this latter term, it's only the inertial mass that's relevant, not the gravitational mass. So again, in our generalized model where gravitational mass and inertial mass are allowed to be independent variables, and assuming that the beam itself has zero gravitational mass and zero inertial mass, the first term in our formula for F alpha will have gravitational mass in the place of the letter m, and the second term in the formula will have inertial mass in the place of the letter m. Okay, but so far I haven't in any sense explained what the fallacy was, because of course we live in a universe where gravitational mass and inertial mass are equal. So where was the fallacy that led to the wrong conclusion about the actual universe that we live in? It's this. Within the system comprising of the beam and the object are a whole load of internal forces that, in particular, have the effect of keeping the beam as a rigid rotating body. And so, when a force like gravity is applied at some point within the system, the effect of that force will be propagated through the system by the internal forces in such a manner as to result overall in some turning effect. That's what's represented by the first term in the formula for F alpha. And likewise, the presence of inertia at some particular point in the system will have its inertial effect propagated through the system by the internal forces in such a manner as to result overall in some kind of rotational inertia, some level of resistance to changes in rotational motion. That's what's represented by the second term in the formula. Now, if the dependence on r in the second term had been the same as the dependence on r in the first term, then we would have had that F0 is proportional to F alpha for fixed alpha. But here's the point. There's no reason for us to have assumed that the mathematical form of how a force has its effect propagate through the system should be the same as the mathematical form of how inertia has its effect propagate through the system. It's because we pictured gravitational mass and inertial mass as being the same concept, as opposed to merely the same value, that we imagined that the task of balancing out a gravitational force is equivalent to the task of achieving a change of motion. So that's what I think is going on subconsciously when we, or at least when I, fall into the fallacy of assuming that F alpha should be proportional to the product of m and r. Okay, so I could stop the video here, but we might still be curious to know, why is it that rotational inertia should have this faster than linear dependence on r that we see in this second term? Can I give an intuition for this faster than linear dependence? Now, Steve Mould's video does, in effect, address and discuss this question, or more specifically, Henry from Minute Physics features in the video to discuss the issue. But I have to admit, when I was watching the video, I had trouble following Henry's explanation. It's only after I did some calculating of my own that I then understood what the video was saying. So, I want to present my own perspective on this issue, which will ultimately be based on the same idea as what Henry was saying. But I'd like to present a couple of different perspectives on how we can gain an intuition for this faster than linear dependence. The first of the two perspectives that I want to present will probably actually feel like it has too many steps to easily provide an overarching intuition. But I think it will still be quite interesting and quite nice, and it will also help to prepare for the intuition behind the second perspective that I want to present, that I think will give a clearer sense of an overarching intuition. So, for the first perspective that I want to present, let's begin by returning to the previous setup of the plate simply being accelerated directly upwards. And what I want to do here is to provide an intuition for how to get from the formula for F0 to the formula for Fa. And this same idea was also alluded to, I think, in Steve Mould's video. The idea is, F0 represents the force required to counteract the natural downwards acceleration, g, and then Fa minus F0 represents the further force required after counteracting this natural downward acceleration to achieve an upwards acceleration of A. And so we expect that what F0 is to g should be the same as what Fa minus F0 is to A. And indeed, combining this equation with our formula that F0 is equal to g times m will give the correct formula for Fa. So let's simply apply the same idea in the lever case. So if I don't apply any downward force on the left side of the lever, then I can ask what the clockwise angular acceleration of the lever will be due to the object on the right side of the lever. And again, I'm just asking about the angular acceleration at the initial moment as the lever starts to turn clockwise from its original horizontal stationary position. So let's call that angular acceleration alpha natural. So then, using the same intuition that I described for the previous setup, I would expect that what F0 is to alpha natural should be the same as what F alpha minus F0 is to alpha. Now, you might be thinking, hold on, isn't this precisely a representation of the wrong intuition that led us to believe that F alpha should be proportional to F0? Well, here's the thing. The natural downward acceleration in the previous setup was simply the constant g, which has no dependence on any other parameters of the setup. But what about in the case of the lever? Well, let me mention two ways in which you can think about how the natural angular acceleration depends on the parameters of the setup. The first is simply in terms of dimensional analysis. We want alpha natural as a function of the parameters m, g, and r. Note that it obviously doesn't depend on d because it's about the motion that happens when we don't apply any force on the left side of the lever. Well, alpha natural has dimension time to the power minus 2, m has dimension mass, g has dimension length times time to the power minus 2, and r has dimension length. Well, one can show that as a result of all this, alpha natural must take the form of some constant dimensionless number times g over r. And so we see that alpha natural depends reciprocally on r, and therefore, Since f0 is proportional to r, we have that f0 over alpha natural is proportional to r squared. And so f alpha minus f0 is likewise proportional to r squared. In other words, after the effect of gravity has been overcome, the further force required to produce a given anti-clockwise angular acceleration alpha is proportional to r squared. Okay, well, the dimensional analysis argument for deriving the form of alpha natural might feel a bit like magic. Can we see a more intuitive argument as to why alpha natural should depend reciprocally on r? Well, remember again that, of course, we're assuming that the beam is weightless. And so, if we're applying no force on the left side of the beam, then the object should behave effectively as if it's in freefall, because it meets no resistance from the beam. In other words, its actual downward acceleration should be equal to g. And so, accordingly, the point on the beam where the object lies, namely the point lying a distance r to the right of the pivot, should likewise have its initial acceleration being a downward acceleration of g. But if the acceleration of that point is a downward acceleration of g, then that implies that the clockwise angular acceleration is smaller for a larger value of r. In fact, the way angles are defined is such that the angular acceleration in this scenario is exactly equal to g over r. In other words, our constant c here is equal to 1. And so the point here is f alpha minus f0 has faster dependence on r than f0 itself does, for reasons that are ultimately rooted in the fact that a given angular acceleration of the beam does not directly correspond to a given actual acceleration of the point in the system where the inertia itself lies. There is a factor of r that controls the relationship between the motion of the beam and the motion of where the inertia lies. And so, in fact, as Henry explains in Steve Mould's video, this lever paradox is not really unique to levers or to rotation. I think one can probably construct a similar paradox for any type of situation where there's a variable controlling the discrepancy between the motion that one is trying to achieve by applying a force and the motion of the actual location of the inertia that's responsible for resisting this desired motion. Well, now you might be thinking, this idea that what f0 is to alpha natural should be the same as what f alpha minus f0 is to alpha, doesn't that go against the narrative that I'm proposing, that f0 has nothing to do with inertial mass, and the extra term in f alpha after overcoming gravity has nothing to do with gravitational mass? Isn't the whole point of the argument that I've just presented that f0 is defined as what is needed to overcome the natural angular acceleration under gravity, and so that natural angular acceleration combines with the notion of rotational inertia to give the value of f0? Well, no, it's the other way round. If you imagine again the world in which gravitational mass and inertial mass are independent parameters, then the calculation for f0 comes purely from the gravitational mass, and only by then combining this with the additional knowledge of the inertial mass can alpha natural be calculated, specifically as the result of dividing our already calculated f0 by a suitable measure of rotational inertia. Okay, and now for my second perspective on how we can intuitively understand this faster than linear dependence on r. So, since the term that we're interested in is the term for the extra force after the effect of gravity has been overcome, let's simplify things by imagining that there is no gravity, so in other words, g is equal to 0. And also, for simplicity, let's assume that d and m are fixed, so that we're only interested in varying the variable r. Now, the principle of levers tells us that for any given position on the left side of the lever and any given position on the right side of the lever, applying a given downward force at the position on the left side is equivalent to applying some particular upward force at the position on the right side, and the relationship between the actual force applied on the left side and the equivalent force applied on the right side is such that the product of force and distance from the pivot is preserved when transforming between the actual and the equivalent scenario. So, applying this to our example, applying a downward force of F at the position of distance d to the left of the pivot is equivalent to applying a certain force upwards at the position of distance r to the right of the pivot, and the relationship between the applied force F and the equivalent force is given by this equation that F times d is equal to the equivalent force times r. Note that this is exactly the same principle of levers that we used to derive our formula for F0 when there was gravity in the system. Now, I've said that d is fixed, and so this means that we can say from our equation that the equivalent force is proportional to the actual applied force divided by r. And so now, looking at the equivalent scenario, and again remembering that the beam itself has no mass and there's no gravity, it seems intuitively reasonable that, on the basis of Newton's second law, the equivalent force will be equal to the mass m times the upward acceleration a of the object, or equivalently of the point on the beam where the object lies. And again, I'm just interested in this acceleration at the initial moment from when the force is applied. Okay, well, what this would then mean is that to achieve a specified angular acceleration alpha, a larger value of r will require a larger value of a, which in turn requires a larger value of the equivalent force. But then, the equivalent force is already, by the principle of levers, reciprocally proportional to r. So the point is that it was already kind of visually obvious from the outset that to achieve a given angular acceleration, if the object is further away from the pivot, then you're going to need a larger value of the applied force F. But what this argument is telling us is that not only are you going to need a larger value of F, but in fact you're going to need a larger value of F divided by R. So again, at the heart of this is the idea that a given desired angular acceleration of the beam doesn't translate directly into an acceleration value for the point where the mass lies, but rather the variable r controls the factor of discrepancy between the two. And to reinforce the point, we can look at the actual formula for F alpha in the original case where we do include gravity. We can express this formula in a factorized form as follows, where this rightmost term just corresponds to the factor that, by the principle of levers, translates between actual force and equivalent force, and then the rest of this expression is the equivalent upward force at the point where the object is, corresponding to the actual applied force of F alpha. But this might look somewhat familiar. We saw a similar expression when we considered our very first setup, specifically in the formula for Fa, the force required to achieve the specified upward acceleration of A. In fact, the only difference is that the A in this formula becomes replaced by R alpha in our formula in the lever setup. But then, R alpha is precisely equal to the upward acceleration A of the point where the object lies, when the angular acceleration is equal to alpha. And so, our formula for F alpha actually again reflects the quantitative equality of gravitational mass and inertial mass, because the g inside the brackets and the acceleration r alpha inside the brackets are both equally being multiplied by the same mass m. So if the actual practical problem of interest to us had been the motion of the object itself, or the motion of some special point on the beam where the object has been placed, then the acceleration A would have been an actual property of the motion that we're ultimately interested in, and thus, perhaps the conceptual distinction between gravitational mass and inertial mass wouldn't have been so much of an issue. But if the actual practical problem of interest is the motion of the beam itself as a whole, well, then from the point of view of inertia, what we ultimately care about isn't so much how the inertia of the object resists the acceleration a, but rather how the inertia of the object resists the angular or rotational acceleration a divided by r. And so, going back to the original fallacy that this video has been seeking to explore, if we conflate the concept of inertia with the concept of gravitational mass, then applying this conflation of concepts to the particular problem of rotation, we might easily make the mistake of assuming that the rotational effect of the object's weight about the pivot, as reflected in the value of F0 times d, should be directly proportional to the rotational inertia about the pivot coming from the object's inertial mass. But this is not the case. Okay, well, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for watching.